Welcome to the second event of the NCC 30th Anniversary and 4th Decade Conference. My name is Haruko Nakamura, and I am the current chair of the NCC. I would first like to express sincere appreciation to the Toshiba International Foundation for supporting this event. I would also like to thank the Japan-US Friendship Commission for the support over the past 30 years. For those of you who are new to NCC, I encourage you to go to our website to find many important resources and guides made available by our fellow NCC colleagues. Over the past 30 years, many of us at the NCC have worked together to expand and enhance access to library resources to support the growth of Japanese studies in North America. For example, this image use protocol guide has been extremely popular, helping many scholars understand how to acquire copyright approval for using image in their publications. NCC has also played an important role advocating to improve access to Japanese information, such as many commercial databases to resources held only in Japan and digital resources like videos and ebooks. And now we are advocating for expanding access to the National Data Library's digital content transition service for overseas libraries. So this 30th anniversary celebration and the 4th decade conference is to both celebrate our achievement and to bring new fresh perspective into the NCC community. For that, Tara McGowan, NCC Executive Director, will detail the rest of events with a few announcements.
Thank you, Haruko-san. I would also like to thank everyone for coming, and I want to share a few updates to our 30th anniversary celebration and 4th decade conference. I think many of you by now are familiar with how to access the events page, but just in case, if you go to our homepage and see the NCC events tab at the top, if you click on that, you can then click on the NCC 30th anniversary. And that will take you to all the events where you can register. You can also give us feedback. We have a Google form for that. And we also will be having the videos of past events if you missed them. So we have one already available for our first event. I would also like to draw your attention to our 30th anniversary reception, which the registration is now open. And thanks to the Toshiba International Foundation, we'll be able to give $30 coupons from Uber Eats to the first 100 registrants. So please register early. Registration ends December 10th because we will be holding this on a platform, WonderMe, and we will need to send out instructions and various information beforehand. So please be sure to register by the deadline, December 10th. Among the other things we'll be sharing at the reception will be the announcement of the recipients of the Comprehensive Digitization and Discoverability Program Award. So we're all looking forward to that. And also, while you're on the website, please check out the highlights of the last 30 years. This was curated by NCC intern Amy Ledbetter. And as you see here, we have a Japanese study spotlight where Paula Curtis, who's here today, has collected many really great testimonials from faculty and librarians about how much NCC resources have meant to them in their careers. So please check that out as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara-san. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today. Professor Jolyon Baraka Thomas is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches on religion as it relates to media, politics, and the law. He's the author of Drawing on Tradition, Manga, Anime, and Religion in Contemporary Japan in 2012, and Faking Liberties, Religious Freedom in American Occupied Japan in 2019, which won an award for excellence from the American Academy of Religion. Professor Thomas has utilized many NCC services for his research and teaching over the years. Also, considering his vast range of research topics, which require accessing a diverse and rich array of resources, we are keenly interested in hearing his vision and the perception of the future of Japan studies in a global context. Now, please welcome Professor Thomas.
Thank you, Haruko-san, and thanks to all of you for being here. I've been watching people's names pop up in the chat and seeing lots of familiar names, and I look forward to seeing your familiar faces at the end of my talk. I'm going to do that awkward thing where I tell you that I'm going to share my screen, and then I poke around for a few minutes while I get things ready, and then I'll launch right in. So I'm here to talk about the sort of current state of Japan studies and information resources, but I've titled my talk Confessions of an Unorthodox Japanologist for a couple of different reasons that should become clear along the way. The first thing is when I got the invitation from Haruko-san, I thought to myself this question, what does a guy like me have to say about libraries and information resources? And to be honest, I thought this is going to be super embarrassing because I don't know what I have to say about this. So I decided to just sort of lean into the embarrassment and to start off with a really embarrassing picture. This is me in 1989. When I first traveled to Japan on a sister city exchange trip. I was born and raised in Des Moines, Iowa. I traveled to the sister city of Kofushi and Yamanashi. And that was the first of many trips to Japan, including a stint where I lived and worked in Tokyo, and then later as a graduate student and as a junior professor, worked and did research in Japan. I'm mentioning these things about my personal biography for a specific reason. Because I think that these sort of journeys back and forth across the Pacific are both representative of, but also departure from what we might think of as the standard biography of a US-born Japan studies researcher. Let me unpack that a little bit. So on the one hand, there are these broad diplomatic structures like the Sister City Exchange Program that fostered my earliest travel to Japan. They created a level of comfort in the country. They helped me satisfy curiosity about Japan that had been fostered through films like the 1995 film, The Karate Kid, right? But I have to admit that I went to Japan, came back, thought it was awesome, and then I promptly forgot about Japan. And I didn't think about Japan at all for years. What happened was that I sort of fell back into my relationship with Japan much later as an adult. So to be clear, I was not a Japan studies major in college. I didn't study the language in college. I only took one course that was specifically on Japan. And after I graduated from college, I moved to Japan on a whim. I didn't move to Japan through one of the sort of big exchange programs like the JET program. I got a job through other means, and it was only after I was living and working in Tokyo that I actually began learning Japanese as a language and turning my pre-existing intellectual interests in religion toward Japan studies. Now, I'm mentioning this because I think that my biography sort of encapsulates a combination of structure and serendipity that I think is not only indicative of the US-Japan relationship or the North America-Japan relationship as a whole. Apologies to my Canadian colleagues. I've been writing a book on the US and Japan, so I sort of default to that. But it also sort of indicates some of the things that we might need to think about as we're talking about library resources. So this is my way of being very honest about how I come to this topic, but also thinking more broadly about a balance that I see between maintenance and flexibility. So I think we're all dependent on maintaining steady, reliable access to Japanese language resources. Those of us who are situated in North America. And this maintenance, I think, is one of the crucial agendas of NCC. That's how I understand it anyway. But we're also in a time of tremendous change and uncertainty, and that requires flexibility. Now, there are lots of different things that we might think of as emergent circumstances that are affecting the state of our field. COVID-19 is obviously one of these circumstances. One of the other things that has been in the background for the last couple of years especially is global protests about anti-Blackness and racist policing, and the ways that those things affect how we go about teaching and learning about Japan. And a big one, because the COP26 is going on in Glasgow right now, climate change is another thing that affects the ways that we need to think about things like travel. How easy is it to get on a plane and travel across the Pacific, to go literally from one side of the globe to the other? So with all of these things in mind, I think we have to make flexibility at least as much an objective as maintenance. So I've already embarrassed myself by showing you a really horrible picture of myself in 1989. Now let me just offer a very frank confession, which is that, like far too many people in the field of Japan studies, I think I've spent most of my career largely ignorant of NCC's work. And I want to just take a moment to highlight something that I think is really important, although not surprising to anybody in this Zoom room, which is that both grad students and faculty often have the privilege of largely ignoring or taking for granted the really crucial work that librarians do in terms of acquisitions and collection development and so forth. And I just wanted to say I see you, and I acknowledge the labor that's involved. And I think it's really important for all faculty to see librarians as partners in the work that we do, as well as language teachers. But although as a graduate student, I saw the acronym NCC without knowing what it stood for, over the years, I learned some things about NCC's work. And it's really astonishing what NCC has already accomplished in the last 30 years. A few things that I've learned directly related to my own experiences as a researcher. So when I was finishing up my 2012 book, Drawing on Tradition, which was about manga and anime, I pretty obviously needed images. But finding permissions for those images was a total pain in the neck. And I had no idea about how to go about this. I should mention, just for context, I was lucky enough to publish this book when I was still a PhD student. So I had very little guidance about even how to go about any of this process. Who came to save me? It was NCC. I found the protocol forms and used them, and I was able to get some really prompt and positive responses from people, or from companies like Kodansha, as I was trying to prepare that book. Now, another thing that comes up is that we all know that nothing compares to actually being in the archives in person. Shout out, by the way, to the archivists who may or may not be on this call, who have directly helped me in my research. I'm thinking about people like Amy Wasserstrom and Kana Jenkins at the Prong Collection. I used that collection extensively for my more recent book. So I just want to say, we all know that it's ideal to be in the archives in person. You encounter things that you wouldn't otherwise encounter. But when you can't do that, and right now is the time when you can't, having access to one or two multi-volume sets can really determine whether a research project is actually feasible. In this light, it is now defunct, or at least on pause, but the multi-volume set purchasing initiative has been a huge help to many researchers. And it's something that I think I would ideally see resumed in the future. Something I didn't know until I was preparing this talk, but I think is super important, is that NCC advocates for us. Why is it that as a registered user of the National Diet Library, I can't access the digital documents that I know I could access if I were able to actually go there and be in Japan? It turns out that I'm not alone in this frustration, and I've learned that NCC has been putting pressure on the Agency for Cultural Affairs to sort this out by thinking about things like Japanese copyright law and how it might be reimagined. And then recently, this new comprehensive digitization and discoverability program helps turn some private collections into public resources. That's huge. That's great. It means that a lot of us are able to, a lot of libraries are able to share their valuable and rare works with research publics. So these are all really, really amazing things. Now I want to turn on my next slide to how NCC's work directly relates to work in progress for me. So I'm working on a book I mentioned a moment ago. It's about religion and public schooling in Japan and the United States in the period from 1945 to 2020. Most people on this call are librarians, so you'll know that that means by definition that the sources that I'm using for this project are under copyright. I can't get access to them. They're not digitally available. I have to be in the archive to see them. I was fortunate enough to have an Abe fellowship that allowed me to be in Japan for a year. And I gathered a lot of articles from specialist journals during that time. But because the fellowship was broken up into two parts and I had planned to return to Japan in 2020, I made the mistake of just being like, oh, I can come back, I can get to that. Oh, I need those specialist journals from the late 1970s. I'll be able to do that when I return. Well, COVID happened. I couldn't have predicted that, but it meant that I wasn't able to get access to some of the things that I wanted to. In a space where I haven't been able to, where COVID has prevented me from returning to Japan, I've wound up relying heavily on multi-volume sets. So for example, multi-volume sets on the history of morality education have wound up featuring very prominently in my bibliography. Now, another thing that I want to mention, which is directly related to the previous bullet point, is that we have public health controls and related austerity measures that have both sort of come into play in the COVID moment. And these have directly and severely limited the ability of North American researchers to travel to Japan. I think under these circumstances, but not only under these circumstances, it seems only proper to introduce some new flexibility into Japan's practices about giving people access to primary sources. And I think NCC can help. I also want to mention, this is not on my slide, but I've been noticing a trend for our colleagues in Europe where their research institutions are requiring them increasingly to share their research in an open access format. I think that open access is in many ways the future of academic work. Shout out to presses like University of California Press that I think have been really pioneering in this regard. But as we're thinking about relationships between North American libraries and Japanese libraries, I also think it's crucial to consider the question, like we need to protect, copyright for people who have generated original work, but the academy falls apart if we don't all have access to work. And I think that open access is one of these ways of ensuring that, and that's something that I'm just throwing this out there as a sort of open-ended topic that we may discuss or return to in Q&A. Now, I've been asked to talk about the state of the Japan studies field, and I don't want to sound overly dramatic here, but I do think that the future of our field is at stake. The evidence that I'm sharing now is mostly anecdotal. It comes from my social media feed, but on Twitter, I have been watching attrition. I've been watching junior researchers quit the study of Japan or shift their projects away from Japan because they can't get into the country to get access to the materials that they need. We're killing the field. The generations are dying off as we speak. This is its own sort of population problem. And I think that a lot of this has been exacerbated by some, how do I put this delicately, some problematic bureaucratic processes about getting, especially students, into Japan. This is something that I think we really need to think about collectively. Okay, so let me turn from some of these things to concrete things that I think NCC can do for the field. And I'm going to talk briefly about teaching, and then I'm going to talk about research, and then I'm going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff. So first of all, teaching. One of the main things that's come up for me is digital rights issues. And this goes a little bit beyond the existing stuff that's available on the NCC website about image use protocols, although there's a lot of helpful stuff there. So as teachers, a lot of us need help navigating what counts as fair use when it comes to digital resources and especially moving images. Let me give an example. So for as long as I've been teaching at Penn, I've been advertising courses with titles like Japanese popular culture or the religion of anime with video trailers and video syllabi. And I do this because I recognized early on that many of our students have grown up on YouTube. They literally do not remember a time when YouTube didn't exist, which makes me feel old. But they also have increasingly been relying on TikTok as another source of information. They're used to getting information via video. But because of that, they're also uniquely susceptible to the alluring qualities of video. So they need to both learn through video, but they also need to learn how video has its own structuring logic. Well, that's my opinion anyway. So I make these 1 to 4 minute videos to introduce students to the basic themes of my courses, but the videos also show as much as tell the kinds of analysis that we will do together in the course. Now, again, at the risk of embarrassing myself, I'm going to, on the next slide, show you a couple of examples of what I'm doing, but I want you to think along with me specifically about staying within the bounds of fair use and whether or not I've actually done so. Now, these are videos, I should clarify, that I have recorded and uploaded to YouTube. Although they're not public, they're privately listed. And so there's a lot of stuff here about trying to toe the fine line between what counts as educational or critical use and so forth. And you'll see that there's a marked difference in terms of the sophistication between the first video, which I made in 2016, and the second one, which I made last year. Okay, enough with the caveats, here we go. Hi everybody, my name is Jolyon Thomas and I'm an assistant professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Penn. I'm making this video as a brief introduction to my course ELK 69, Japanese Popular Culture. In terms of an overview of the course, the first thing that we do in the course is we kind of take a broad historical view about all the different ways that people have used popular media in Japan over Japan's long history. We move from that into a discussion of manga and anime specifically, looking at some of the compositional techniques that manga artists use and how they very skillfully meld word and image to tell their stories. We look at how anime directors will engage in some really amazing sleight of hand to trick the eye into seeing motion where there is none. And then we move from there into analyzing things like the industrial dispositions or the organizations that structure things like the production of manga and anime, but also J-pop and other forms of Japanese music like Japanese hip-hop. So that's one way that the course is organized, but another way is around a set of themes, sort of contentious issues facing Japanese society today. Okay, so there's a little bit more of this video, obviously, but I'm not going to subject you to the entire thing. I just want to contrast what is basically a montage approach with a very different approach that I adopted for this sort of teaser trailer for my course last year, again, holding in mind things about whether this falls within fair use or not. The sound of higurashi, a kind of cicada endemic to Japan, tells us that it's summer. Light comes from the top left and shines across the screen. A torii, a symbol of a Japanese Shinto shrine, stands in the background over the young girl playing hide and seek. Like most anime, the scene is composed of layers, indicating depth. A cat moves from right to left across the screen, matching the motion of the camera as it zooms in on the girl. There are cinematic cuts that bring us closer and closer to the girl's perspective. And if you know something about Japanese religion, then you know that the torii that she was sitting under is often the entrance to another world. Now, this girl is confused, but we don't have to be. My name is Jolyon Thomas, and this is the religion of anime. Okay. So I think it's pretty obvious that this is me experimenting with video as a way of trying to capture student interest and get butts in seats. There's a very instrumentalist approach there, but I've always been sort of constrained by both what the digital rights management sort of tools built into YouTube allow me to do, and then also within my own sort of commitment to making sure that people's intellectual property is respected. So that's one thing that I've been sort of just thinking through, and I think NCC can help with. Another thing has to do with screenings of films. So as recently as a few years ago, I would hold the screenings of the assigned films, and there was an assigned film every week for this class, after class. And I quietly opened up these screenings to members of the community as a sort of public outreach. Well, that turned out to be a bit of a mistake. As studios have gotten more aggressive in policing campuses for copyright infringement, librarians in turn have been under pressure to crack down on unnecessary digitization of films, especially for extracurricular viewing like this. So I've had to adjust my practices. Now, I'm lucky, I'm very fortunate. Penn recently changed its class schedule, and I took advantage of that change to add 2 whole hours to the class meeting time. I can now screen a whole film during my class. I can do all of the analysis and critique that is necessary. This falls within academic fair use. But it's very clear that not everyone has this option. It's clear that even if I were to try this a few years ago, I wouldn't have done it. The only reason I can get away with this is that I've built up the popularity of this course, and students will now be willing to sit through a course that meets for much longer than a normal course. Anyway, all of this, to sum all of this up, I think we need to figure out ways for teachers to get permission, not only to get access to films through sources like Canopy, but to figure out ways to provide password protected digital copies for student use, or to get new permissions forms that would allow us to get exemptions from paying some of the screening fees that studios will otherwise demand. This is a pretty big ask, but I think it would be a huge help for me. And for others. And I think it's crucial to highlight here that a lot of students, a lot of those butts and seats that we see are because students like Japanese media, they like Japanese film, they like anime and so forth. That's what they're hoping to see when they come to our classes, excuse me. Okay, so now let me talk about some other issues that are related to the broader state of the field, and specifically about building the pipeline. So recently, the Japan-US Friendship Commission and the Association for Asian Studies have exhibited a strong new interest in diversifying the field of Asian studies and also ensuring the equitable distribution of resources. As one of the co-authors of the 2020 petition to the AAS to promote support for Black and other underrepresented scholars, I think it's pretty obvious that I think this is a good thing. But I also want to highlight that DEI initiatives are often superficial. They tend to privilege the perspectives of the powerful. They often serve to insulate institutions from criticism. They're not designed to elicit meaningful change. So if we want these things to actually make change, these DEI initiatives have to be concrete and specific. They cannot be platitudinous and vague. Let me put this in terms of 2 related long-term goals. One thing that might be helpful as librarians and others are thinking about these sorts of things is we want to make it utterly unremarkable that any Black or Latinx or any other historically underrepresented student is studying Japan or Japanese language. We don't want people to do a double take when they see somebody like me at the front of a Japan studies classroom, right? Which unfortunately is something that still happens. Another related goal is that we need to build the pipeline very deliberately and expand support, including financial support for institutions like historically Black colleges and universities, and build outreach programs for students in high school and below. And I think one of the crucial things that's often been overlooked here is that this must happen in non-wealthy districts. Now, one other contextual issue is that learning Japanese is very difficult and time consuming. Some people say it's the most difficult language on the planet, although I think that that's just a ridiculous way of comparing. But it's important because students are increasingly coming into colleges and universities with a pre-professional orientation. They've been trained for like more than a decade before they even get to the college campus to think about college's preparation for a career. And that means that they also think instrumentally about the courses that they take. And they will often opt for less demanding languages, even if they love Japanese media. And I think we all know that many of them do. Adding to this problem, we have austerity measures that are preferred for our state institutions by many state legislatures, but even for private institutions, many higher ed administrators have been talking austerity talk. They use that sort of language to rationalize combining or cutting area studies programs and language programs. This is a problem for all of us. And I want to highlight, I'm at an institution with a multi-billion-dollar endowment, and even at my institution, we have to scramble for resources regularly. If that's true at an institution like Penn, then it certainly is true for other institutions that are going to struggle a lot more to build programs, let alone to develop significant library holdings. So if we want Japan studies to thrive, I think we need to make it as easy as possible for students to learn the language, and also as easy as possible for them to get to Japan for those next steps of immersion experiences. But there's a problem. Recently, Colcon did a study that's a cultural exchange council between Japan and the United States about student mobility between the two countries. And the study suggested that the number of Japanese students studying in long-term, especially degree-granting programs in the US had dwindled significantly in the first decade of this century. Anecdotally, my colleagues in Japan tell me that this is not just a matter of fewer students in all because of Japan's declining birth rate, but it's also due to widespread and I think deserved perceptions of the US as dangerous. We've got guns, Japan doesn't. Even when the Japanese government puts pressure on universities to globalize, that has led to some changes, but the numbers remain lower than I think any of us would like. When we talk about flows of students going the other way, I think that we also have some problems in terms of educational parity, specifically in terms of academic rigor. A problem that I encountered directly at Penn is that some of our students were traveling to Japan to study at elite universities, which shall go unnamed, to take courses that could not possibly earn them equivalent credit at Penn. I couldn't give them credit for a course that had no assigned reading, right? And so there's an issue of parity here that also means that students, if they're not going to be able to receive credit, are going to be much less likely to go to Japan, and that's a problem for all of us. Now, COVID-19 has exacerbated all of this. Governmental restrictions on entry have led a lot, I mentioned this before, but it's led to a lot of students simply giving up. Japan, I tried, they're saying in their tweets, but I've given up on you. That's a problem. Now, here's the question that I think many of you have probably been like holding in your minds, like, well, okay, that's great, Thomas, but what can librarians do about all of this? I think one of the things that librarians do that's often underappreciated is to bring people into the field by making certain resources available. Tough talk about Asian studies. Okay, so anybody associated with area studies generally, but Japan studies specifically is going to quickly encounter a problem about DEI initiatives. That's essentialism. The essentialist claim that Japan is utterly unique is baked into Japanese language pedagogy. It often features in introductory courses on Japan. But any assertion that Japanese people are intrinsically different from other people by simple virtue of being Japanese is a racist claim. It excludes people and it downplays Japan's internal diversity. So meaningful diversity, equity, and inclusion work requires collectively reimagining our whole field. This means a lot of people, from librarians to professors to language instructors and students, rethinking everything. How do we teach language? What do we describe as Japanese culture? Whose voices are we including? This starts in the stacks. These are things that librarians can do right now. Do the holdings that are in Japanese language include works by authors who are not ethnically Japanese? Do works that are in translation reflect the widest possible range of Japanese experiences, including people who have been colonized, or the voices representing Ainu or Ryukyuan or Zainichi perspectives of people from traditional outcast communities? For the existing collections, things like manga and film, have you recently gone through and examined it for potentially caricatured or racist depictions of non-Japanese people? I assure you, there are many of them there. Can you contextualize those caricatures for potential readers or viewers? giving them a content warning, just saying like, hey, there's blackface in this, so that students aren't surprised, as some of my students have been, unfortunately. And I also think, and I'm nearing the end of my comments here, just in case you're bored of hearing me talk. I also think that NCC can continue its ongoing work in developing and expanding access. I know that NCC is already working on developing resource sharing options that make it a lot easier for students and faculty that are at under-resourced institutions to take advantage of major institutions' libraries. But I still think that there's a lot more that can be done here. So, just thinking about the Tadoku project, which is based on this idea that like people learn languages quickly and naturally if they can just be exposed to literature. Indeed, that's how I first learned Japanese. That's really hard to do if your institution doesn't have Japanese materials to begin with, or if it takes forever for them to get to your students. Let's just think of a regional or a local example. Here in Philly, we have at least 60 institutions like in my backyard. Penn, Temple, Swarthmore, Villanova, and so forth. But how many of them have significant programming on Japan, or, let alone resources in Japanese? I know from talking with some colleagues at these other institutions, places like the Community College of Philadelphia or Arcadia University, that there's serious interest in Japan studies, but these institutions just don't have library resources that we have at Penn or at a place like Temple. So I'm curious about what NCC can do to facilitate sharing between, say, urban and suburban institutions, which may be fairly close together, and also what alternative arrangements might be necessary for rural or otherwise geographically isolated institutions. That's an open question, but I think that one of the things that's probably pretty obvious is that money is necessary for this. So let me just close with a couple of final thoughts. First of all, my own biography shows that although trajectories can be uneven or unexpected, that early and repeated exposure to Japan stuff just means a higher likelihood that people will choose Japan-related careers in the future. So I think we need to think very creatively and aggressively about expanding such exposure to the communities that wouldn't already get it. So that means outside of wealthy school districts and beyond well-endowed universities. I think we also need to think very frankly about the dismal state of academic hiring. We have to be creative and think realistically about what people can do with Japanese language and research skills outside of the academy. For many of our students, that means thinking about careers in Japan. But here comes another bit of tough talk. Frankly, the current Japanese governmental policies at a very fundamental level privilege a fictive notion of blood over kinship. This is, again, a racist understanding of how the world works. Because of that, they don't make it easy for people to imagine having a professional life in Japan. And again, anecdotally, I see a lot of people try to have professional lives in Japan and then give up because it's just too hard to integrate. I think Japan has to be a lot more flexible in facilitating flows of information and people outward and inward. And one of the things that's really inspiring to me about having the opportunity to speak with all of you today is that I think librarianship is an underappreciated but very crucial aspect of this work. So that's the end of my formal comments. I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I really look forward to your questions, comments, and just a general conversation about the state of Japanese studies today.
Thank you very much, Professor Thomas, for the intriguing and inspiring presentation. Now we would like to move to the Q&A session and the open discussion. Professor Dennis Forrest, Wen Chao Chen, Professor of East Asian Social Science at the Kalamazoo College and current member of the NCC Executive Committee, will be a moderator.
Hi, everyone. If you have questions for our speaker, please go ahead and add those to the chat. And what I'll do is I'll just read them out as they come in, and I'll more or less do them in order that they come in here. And as thank you very much for that really great talk, Professor Thomas. Some really kind of thought-provoking points that I'm really glad you had a chance to share with us today, your experiences and kind of some of these ideas for kind of moving forward. So while I wait for some of the comments to start coming in, I thought I would pick up on a point you raised that I would really love to hear your specific thoughts on, and I'm open to hearing others, of course, too. But you mentioned this idea of community outreach, and you mentioned kind of several aspects of it. And in particular, you kind of talked about kind of well-researched institutions, kind of in institutions that are less well-resourced. But one point you also mentioned is kind of outreach into high schools and into kind of maybe underserved high schools. And, I'm struck by the fact that, I'm in Kalamazoo, which has, a very large public school system. We don't have Japanese at our high school, but we do have Chinese. And I think this is, a kind of an unspoken aspect of some of our discussions sometimes, is that there's almost a competition going on with China and Japan studies. And this is a case where we're completely losing all these students who might have this interest. So do you have thoughts on how it might be possible to do some of those high school outreach programs, and maybe experiences you've worked with, and other things too? So thanks.
Yeah, so this is something that we've been talking about a little bit at Penn, but we haven't instituted yet. This is a conversation that for us came up last summer, summer 2020, in the height of the George Floyd protests. For, I think, obvious reasons, I'm a Black American. Many of my colleagues were coming to me and saying, like, how do we deal with this? What do we do? And one of the things that I kept finding myself saying to them is, it's not enough to start when students are already in college. Interest in Japan starts earlier. It's usually coming through media and fashion, although not exclusively. But nobody, I don't want to say nobody, that's ridiculous, but very few students would take their sort of like aesthetic attraction to like manga and anime and think, oh, I can make a career out of this, right? And one of the main things that's necessary is to just see somebody else who's already done it, right? To see somebody else who is interested in Japan or who has traveled to Japan, and to say, oh, that person did it. So then it becomes a possibility, whereas before it wasn't a possibility, right? And that's part of why I started my talk the way that I did. I happened to be in a town where there was a sister city exchange program, and I happened to be in a family where I was sort of supported in going on this trip. It made Japan thinkable for me. Even if I sort of like stopped thinking about Japan for several years, it made it thinkable for me to go. And if I think about my neighbors here in Philly, many of them would just never think about it. They might like spend all day watching anime and think, oh, Japan's super cool, but it might as well be Mars, right? And I think if we can set up things which probably involves faculty volunteering their time, and I don't want to volunteer anybody else's time, but if we can set up things where faculty are willing to go to a local high school every once in a while and just be like, hey, this is how I got to Japan. These are the things that I did. Then I think students are going to be asking for Japanese language classes, right? And one other thing that I'll say, I know there are other questions coming up in the chat, but is my impression that the difficulty of language works against the Chinese language folks as well as the Japanese language folks. And so even though there's been this weird competition, I think in the context of a pre-professional, very instrumentalist understanding about what the world is like right now, I think a lot of students are shying away from both of these languages. And we shouldn't pit Japan studies against Chinese studies too much, because I think that will actually undermine the broader goals that we might all collectively have. I'll cut myself off there.
Terrific, thank you. So let's see, there was a question from Ing Liu. Dr. Thomas, great talk. Could you please talk more on how to make EDI initiatives specific and concrete in Japanese studies?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think I have 30 minutes and I was trying to like gesture at a bunch of different stuff, and probably the impression was that I was throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what stuck. But let me just reiterate one of the things that I said on one of my slides, which is that I think that there are things that we can do in the stacks right now, just in terms of acquisitions, making sure that the broadest possible range of people who are speaking and writing in Japanese, and the broadest possible range of experiences of Japan is represented. That's the heart of at least the diversity, if not also the inclusion sort of aspect of, you know, that awkward and sometimes irritating acronym, right? That okay, so let me put it this way. In the United States, there's still this assumption, and I think, and I'll speak about Canada as well here. In Canada as well, there is this assumption that whiteness is normative. And in Japan, there is an assumption that Yamato ethnicity is normative, that everybody is, if anybody is not that, then they're somehow deficient. Our job is to figure out a way to make that an impossible way of thinking, right? Because if we don't do that, then we allow white supremacy and Japanese supremacy or Yamato supremacy to continue. So that is going to be really uncomfortable to some, and we see the throes of this all around us. We see it in certain political responses to various educational initiatives and so forth. But I think that if we don't do that decentering work, then we might as well just scrap DEI altogether and just say, we are comfortable with white supremacy. We're comfortable with Yamato supremacy. I hope that people are not comfortable with it and they're willing to change. Okay, so representing maximum number of voices is one thing. Thinking about inclusion specifically can start with something as simple and as complicated as whose body can get into the stacks, right? To think about disability for a moment. You know, if somebody uses a powered wheelchair and they can't get access to the stacks, then you know, I think that disabling function of the way the stacks is organized is not that person's fault. It's the fault of how we've sort of conceived of the world, and we need to pause and think about that. Now, we can't change architecture that's already been constructed, but we can think about all of the different ways that we might make it much easier for people to get access to those resources. And the equity issue, and again, there's a lot more that we could talk about here, but the equity issue, I think a really big one is, and sort of an obsession of mine right now, is just, I've been paying a lot of attention to the disparities in Philadelphia, a large, very poor city, where schools that are close to Penn are really well resourced and they get a lot of support. I'm talking about public schools here. And schools that are far away are under-resourced, and they are literally falling apart. And there's like one librarian for every 15 schools or something like that, right? Like everything comes down to like how we provide money and how we equally and equitably distribute resources. And I think that so many of us are so focused on our little fiefdoms about whether we got this budget line or whether we got this support from the dean or whether we're actually going to get money for a hire, that we forget that we also have a public outreach component that is part of our job, and that we're tax exempt because we're supposed to provide something to the public. And one of the ways that we can do that, one of the ways that we can really make DEI a reality, is to say, like, to just ask a question: would you have a need, or would your students be interested in some programming that we might provide, right? And I think that it involves just sort of like being humble and asking questions and trying to figure things out. But there are probably a lot of kids out there who would be future Japan studies majors and future professors of Japanese studies that just never even had an opportunity to think through this stuff. And I think the burden is on us, because we already have a certain degree of privilege, to share that privilege with others. I've just rambled a lot, but hopefully that's helpful.
That was terrific. Thank you. There was one more question here from Haruko. So specifically around your question about getting permissions for image use. what sort of element in the guide would you think would be most helpful to scholars like yourself that are and others that are interested in teaching and using video kind of in the ways that you mentioned?
Yeah, great. I'm so glad that you asked this question. So one of the things that I encountered before I settled on expanding the meeting time for my class, I was trying to do all of these workarounds where, for reasons that I don't think will surprise anybody having heard my talk, I try not to burden my students with expenses to take my course. So I want to provide them with, if they're going to buy a book, it's only going to be one book. And if they're going to watch videos, I want Penn to pay for it. I don't want them to have to pay. So one of the things that I was experimenting with along the way was reaching out to the rights holders of videos that I wanted to screen and saying, well, how much does it cost for me? Like, will you give me permission to show this to my class? Will you give me permission to show this outside of class time? And so forth. A lot of that stuff I could do in English because there are, US-based rights holders for a lot of these things, but in some cases I couldn't. And there's some really powerful studios like Studio Ghibli that refuse to allow digitization of their works, right? And so if NCC could develop some way of helping powerful institutions like Studio Ghibli see that what we're doing in the classroom is different from what somebody else might be doing in terms of like a public screening, that could really help us a lot in terms of helping people not only have access to those powerful and inspiring films, but also to learn how to analyze them, analyze how they're made, and analyze, the directorial genius that goes into them. So those are some of the things that I've thought about. I think even just a quick template, like the image use protocol template for, even for writing to those rights holders in English, I've just sort of experimented and written some very unprofessional emails that have gotten some blunt, brusque responses. And it would be really great to have a template that would be tested and effective for writing to those people and just being like, look, I'm teaching this class. The students are reading these things. I want them to watch these 4 films and you hold the rights to 3 of them. Can I screen these films? And please, my institution has no money. Can you waive the fee that you would normally charge? Because this is really in the interest of academic sort of learning and so forth. This is not about anybody making a profit. I think that might require some experimentation. That was one of the words that I threw out there, but I think for me, and especially for other people who are interested in doing this kind of teaching, it would be extremely helpful.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. And I do know that I think Haruko had a couple of closing remarks. So I just want to say thank you so much, Professor Thomas, for the terrific talk and the great discussion. Thank you for the questions that came in. This was absolutely delightful. So thank you. And for really important topics for us to hear. So thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I kind of try not to say too much because I wanted to let other people to talk and then ask questions. But I wanted to also mention like books like Tadoku, and if there's no like librarian who can catalog, it's not even available in a public library because it's a lots of work to even catalog those things. And so it's that kind of hidden work. Actually, it's never seen, but actually it is important because again, like you said, there's a lots of different kind of like traditionally we didn't use like those kind of ehon or all those kind of small books, but now we have to have it, not have to, but we want to have it. But then we have to make it available, and by making available we have to do like this kind of tedious work, which is cataloging, acquisition, and all that sorts, which is not seen by usually outside. So I just wanted to make that. But anyway, thank you so much. Now I talk too much. Now I believe our time is almost up. Our next event will be on December 9th. Professor Yoshitaka Yamamoto, Associate Professor at the National Institute of Japanese Literature, NIJL, and at the Sokendai, the Graduate University for Advanced Studies, will look to the future and discuss ways for us to nationally and internationally collaborate. The presentation will be 5 to 6, not 4 to 6, 4 to 5 Eastern Standard Time. So make sure. Also, we would like to hear from you about your thoughts and idea. So please share your feedback anonymously on this. There's a Google form, but the Google format is on our 30th anniversary website, so you can go there. So anyway, again, thank you very much, Professor Thomas, and then Professor Forrest, and thank you for all you for attending. See you in December.